Hi, this is JP Morgan.
And this is Kenneth Merrill.
Today on the Slanted Lens, we got Madison Bird here with us, and she's going to help us take a look at the new Sony A1.
And the Canon R5.
I have to say that the Sony A1, for me, checks about every single box I could possibly want in a camera. It's a mirrorless camera, it's a full frame, it gives you a 51 megapixel sensor, it gives you great codecs, 8K, 4K, stabilization. I mean, it just, I don't know where to stop. I mean,
The
it is.
autofocus is amazing. The
autofocus
rolling shutter
is
is very low. I mean, when that was released, I kind of felt like, oh, is the Canon R5 going to be left in the dust here? But I do think the Canon R5 is still competitive in some ways. Number one being price. It is $2,500 cheaper, which is, you know, not nothing.
It's almost 50%.
And it's still $4,000.
I
mean,
know.
This is such an expensive camera.
It is a very expensive camera.
It shoots a little faster. It shoots 12 frames per second instead of 10 frames per second. The buffer lasts a little longer.
So we're just going to get to it. We're going to look at the dynamic range on these two cameras, look at the ISO comparison. We're going to test the 8K and 4K, that 422 10-bit. This also doesn't have a clip limit. It will run, it runs as long as you need it to, which is a huge advantage over the R5.
Yep.
So let's just get to it, see where these two cameras are at, and see what you like.
The first test we're going to do is our classic picture quality portrait test. These are both $4,000 plus, so I imagine they'll be pretty good either way.
First off, it's really hard to look at these images and to not let the lenses get in the way. You know, how much of this is sensor, how much of it is lens? Well, this 50mm lens from Sony is not a great lens. We'll try not to say that every time we look at something, but I'm afraid we may.
It's not a great lens.
No. And compared to the RF lens, it's just kind of night and day.
Yeah, I mean, if you zoom in here on her eye, you'll see it's just not great.
It's just not super sharp. Color on these things look great. The Sony looks exactly what you think. It's a little more cool. The RF lens, or the Canon's a little more warm. Boy, it's right in line with what we've always seen with Sony and Canon. And I love the warmth of Canon color, you know, but again, you could correct these and make them very similar to one another. So this is Kenneth's favorite test, the dynamic range test.
I love dynamic range.
Loves looking at
I'm
this.
a geek for this.
And this is a good situation because we've got her in the shade, she's got a little bit of highlight coming from outside in the sun, but we see that bright kind of ground behind her, and then the shadow of the building. The side of the building is really bright.
We did meter off of her face, and so her face is properly exposed. In that proper exposure, everything was held. Neither of these cameras were clipping anything. It was really good. There's a lot of flexibility in these images. At -3 stops is usually where you start to see a little of the noise creep into the shadow. I feel like we're not really seeing too much of that here. We're holding even the darker parts of the image, like down here by her arm. Now, -4 stops. You do start to see it now. We're losing detail in her face, like around her eye. You see that grain coming in her cheek. Oh, wow, you know, the Canon, this could be a lens thing again, but the Canon has the real clarity to it.
Boy, the sharpness of those two, well, it's definitely the lens, you know.
Yeah.
It's got to be.
color-
-5 stops, they're still holding. The color hasn't shifted that much.
I feel like
becoming red. The Sony's getting
the
red.
Sony's
it's
getting pretty
noise,
red.
Yeah.
the Canon's getting a little bit of purple in the shadows, like her hair and stuff.
The Sony's becoming really crunchy. You see it in her
Yeah.
hair. You see it kind of bit mapping through her hair. It's still very smooth on the Canon.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
Really, really nice on the Canon. Okay, here at +1, we are seeing a little bit of clipping off the bat. The Canon a little more so over by that garage.
That garage is definitely losing the side of it. A little bit in the ground. You don't see
Yeah.
the tonality and the tans in the Canon like you do in the Sony.
The Sony's holding pretty well.
It is.
+2 stops, they're both going a little more nuclear. The ground's gone.
Boy.
The garage is gone.
Canon's kind of gone now.
The color in her face is shifting pretty badly in the Canon too.
Yep.
And then +3 stops. The Canon's
Boy.
definitely clipped. The
Color
Sony's
just went to
starting
pieces.
to clip on her cheek and stuff. But
Yeah. Sony is a little more in the middle. You're getting a
Yeah.
little bit above and a little bit below, whereas Canon seems like it's set where you're getting below and not as much above. So in some ways, the way that Sony is set up is a more desirable as far as hitting your exposure. You can be above or below a
Yeah.
little bit and you're going to be okay. Very interesting though. Great cameras with regards to that. You know, it just gives you so much leeway, so much latitude when you're shooting. So we're going to do our ISO test now. We've got just a window light coming in here on Madison. It really is a beautiful light on her face, but it lets our background go very dark. We're going to look at which one of these cameras really holds the detail in that black the best and just compare them as we go up from 800 and higher. Anything below 800, we know both these cameras are going to do very well with, but 800 and higher, let's just see where they fall apart.
off the bat, the Sony is usually darker, and I should have mentioned that even in the dynamic range test, I had to push the Sony images by 3/4 of a stop to match the Canon. Well, I mean, 800, I do feel like there is some texture interface. You can see it better in the Sony because it's not quite so hot. If we move to 1600, yeah, still pretty clean. You do see some noise in the background.
You see some in the background starting to build just a little bit.
Yeah, behind. Even 3200 is looking really, really nice. Again, I mean, we still see some texture in her face, but it seems to be holding.
You're starting to see it though. You're starting to see it along the bridge of her nose there. You're starting the shadows are starting to break up just a little bit.
Even the background looks pretty good. 3200 ISO.
It's just both these cameras are pretty darn amazing.
I feel like in most scenarios, you're not going to be shooting 3200 ISO, but there are some advantages to this, like Canon's new 800mm f11.
F11.
Most wildlife photographers would kind of, pan that because they have to shoot in lower light situations often. But if you can push your ISO to 3200, that gives you, what, 4 stops? 6400 ISO.
I start to see it in these chin lines of her.
That's true.
I start to see this. It's in the shadow transitions. When you're going from highlight to into shadows, you start to see this kind of posterized look. And I definitely see it in here. It's like it just starts to have an unreal kind of color look. And that's definitely
12,800. You definitely see it here, and it's getting this flat sort of feeling to it. And it's not just a noise issue, it's like a tonality issue. As you raise the ISO, you're actually losing dynamic range. 25,600, I feel like, I mean, her face looks okay, but if you look off to the side.
Well, if you look off the side, it's really
the shadow areas are just
up.
really broken up. I think for the low light, both cameras did really fantastically. It would be hard to pick a clear winner there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to take a look at the autofocus on both of these cameras. These two cameras are very head-to-head when it comes to autofocus. We're just going to see on that high speed if you can get every one of those images in focus and which one of these does the best. So let's take a look at that.
So with the autofocus test, we did 2 different versions. One that was out in the sun, she's backlit, normal scenario, and one that was in low light, where she starts kind of with some light on her, but still pretty dark, and then just moves into blackness, basically. And with the normal autofocus test, it seemed like both cameras were doing really great in the moment, and they both, I was like, wow, these are both awesome. We pulled the images in, the Canon was flawless, just amazingly sharp. Every single image tracked perfectly. The Sony, there was something wrong because she was soft. She was soft almost the whole time, really, and we weren't sure if it was the lens, but then it seemed like the focus was it was leading her a little bit.
Felt like it was in front of her until she hit a certain point, then it followed her.
So we went and reshot just a quick focus test with ourselves with the Sony out front here. We stopped down to 2.8 to make sure it wasn't the lens really at issue. And it did better. The focus was better.
It held us better as we walked towards the camera, much better. It was a much more contrasty situation, more brightly lit, so there was just more contrast in the scene. That's much easier for autofocus to hang on to and to hold that image. So
I don't know what to think of that.
I mean, the Canon was good. It was spot on. It had no problems whatsoever. The Sony was pretty good when we shot it out this morning, but didn't do that well yesterday with a little lower light situation. Not low light situation.
But just like a more flat situation, really.
Yeah. So I
don't know what to think of that.
Not conclusive. Conclusive that the Canon did really well. Not so conclusive about the Sony. It did some well and some not. And so I think that could be lens, could be scenario.
And then in the low light test, the Sony actually performed a little better. We started at 400 ISO and then gradually dropped the ISOs. We're in this dark situation, so she's probably 4 or 5 stops underexposed.
Yeah, this is really dark.
And the Sony did really well. When we got into the 100 ISO range, there were a few images that were soft, but it held her really well in that low light scenario. The Canon, it did really well up to a point at 100 ISO. In the darkest moments, it just said, sorry, I can't.
Yeah, we're just done.
So the Sony did a little bit better than the Canon in the low light situation.
Which doesn't make sense to me because of the other test we did. So.
Yeah. I will say with the other test, the Sony did in the camera say it was on her eye the whole time. So when we pull in the photos and they're not quite sharp, that is a little disconcerting to me.
Yeah.
Whereas the Canon, at that one point just says, sorry, I can't focus.
Yeah. So here's our video.
This is 8K. We've downscaled it to 4K when we went in the color. And also, this is C-Log 1. I think they just released a C-Log 3 update for this camera, but we weren't able to install that on the camera that we rented. So This is working off C-Log 1, and you'll see how that dynamic range, like look at her forehead, it's clipping a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
When you apply the LUT, it just doesn't come out as nice as the Sony does. I mean, again, she's a little hot on her face, but it doesn't clip the way the Canon does.
Look at her forehead. You don't get that bright spot. It's just a nice gradation. You can see it's a highlight.
And that's just the advantage. S-Log 3 has roughly 13 or 14 stops of dynamic range, whereas C-Log 1 has 10 to 11.
What are we thinking about the stabilization on those two?
I think the stabilization on this Sony is kind of amazing.
It is. I'm looking at it right now going, it's just kind of glides around. It's very nice, very smooth.
You see a little bit of the jitteriness, yeah. The Canon is really good with the stabilization, but there is something to the motion here.
There's this, when you move back, it kind of feels like it's behind you a little bit.
And if you make those quick adjustments, it judders. You know? So I actually feel like the Sony stabilization is just a tiny bit better.
Yeah, I think you're right.
All right, that was the 8K footage. Now let's look at the 4K 10-bit. So this is the HQ setting on the Canon. The footage looks really pretty. I think it looks a little better than the 8K because you have that 422
so much
depth.
Better. Look at that. Look at the gradation on her forehead. Absolutely. I mean, just the colors are very pretty.
It's funny because it's still C-Log 1, but you're already getting more of that tonality. On the Sony, there was a little bit of a crop for us when we were shooting 4K.
Yep.
I think when you're shooting the 422, both cameras start to look really nice, and I imagine with the C-Log 3 firmware update for the R5, it'll kind of even out that image quality a bit because you're going to get more dynamic range in both cameras. That being said, the functionality of the Canon is very lacking.
Well, because you're talking about overheating, and the overheating and the clip size of 29 minutes, you know, it really, those two things. Although, you know what, most of us who have shot on Canons have kind of gotten past the clip thing. I mean, if you're on set and you're slating, that's a pain in the butt. But a lot of times people, you're just doing this kind of run and gun workflow, and it's so easy to sync everything up by audio.
And it's true, a lot of people aren't going to be rolling for more than 20 minutes at a time. If you're doing a lot of YouTube stuff or vlogging, 20 minutes might be plenty for you, so the overheating issue isn't an issue.
All right, so let's wrap this up.
Who are these cameras for? Who picks the Canon versus who picks the Sony?
Well, first off, across the board, it's going to be for people who are doing sports, great, you know, a lot of high action types of situations.
Or even high-end like fashion and stuff like that. They're both very high megapixels. Landscape.
Landscape. Great at 50mm on these cameras. Doing that kind of cylindrical landscape stitching would be fabulous.
Yeah. The truth is, both cameras will do almost everything really, really well.
Yes, almost.
Everything.
Canon falls short when it comes to the video.
And we've been saying this for the last year, so we won't belabor it, but again, if I'm on set and I'm shooting video, the last thing I want to be thinking about is my camera going to overheat?
Yeah.
And for that reason alone, if I am primarily a video shooter, I would definitely look at the Sony A1. But then again, if I'm just a video shooter, I'm probably...
If you're just a video shooter, you're not going to buy this camera.
Exactly. That is where I feel like the Sony is kind of hard because it's like you're spending $6,500 and it's not a great video camera. I mean, if you're going to spend that much money on video, I would buy an actual video camera, even if it's the FX6.
So that's just depends on how you work. I know a good friend of mine who runs and guns, shoots all over the world for an oil company, and he just wants everything in one camera because he wants to stills and he's going to go to video, and he's by himself. He's not going to carry two cameras. He's not going to do that. It just does not work. Two great cameras head to head. That's like two heavyweights. I mean, you still are spending $2,000 more for the Sony, but you are getting a much more capable cinema-type camera. Yeah. And I think that's really, it shows that that's where your money goes.
That being said, maybe you could just spend $4,000 here and get a cinema camera on the side.
Have that and a cinema camera?
I don't know.
All right, there you have it. Two great cameras. If you want to leave a comment, ring that bell, and subscribe here at Slanted Lens. Keep those cameras rolling.
And keep on clicking.